I am extremely excited to be in a position to introduce someone that I greatly admire, our School of Data Sciences data activist in residence, Renée Cummings. She's a criminologist. She is, I'm not sure if I can use the word badass on this platform, but I already did. So I think that is the most apt description I can give. Absolutely amazing. Renée is going to be presenting her work on secretive surveillance. She's going to be joined by two amazing alumni of our MS in Data Science program, Claire and Sarah. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Siri, for that fantastic introduction. And of course, good morning to all of you. This is such an honor and a really unique pleasure, because not only am I getting an opportunity to launch for the first time a very exciting project that I've been working on called A Right to Know, but it's also a great moment for me. This is the month when we're celebrating women. We celebrated International Women's Day, and I have had the extraordinary pleasure of working with two fantastic women, and Sarah and Claire, who you're going to meet now, who are part of my team. So we could move that slide forward. And let me just say something. Not only are they beautiful, you can see that in their fantastic photographs, but they are brilliant. They are absolutely brilliant. They are bold in the world of data science, because we're doing something that is brand new here. And they are also brave, because about a year ago, they accepted the extraordinary challenge to join me in developing a tool that you're going to hear about, a public interest tech tool that really engages us from a civic perspective when we think of data science. So as we move forward, and Sarah, you can move the slide forward, I just want to tell you about our agenda. So we're going to do this introduction. We're going to give you some background and some motivation as to why we are presenting A Right to Know. You're going to see the methods, the data models. You're going to understand the meaning of digital force within the context of surveillance. We're going to give you a demo on the website that we are building, in the process of building. Of course, we have a conclusion as to why all of this is important, in a space for question and answers. So we can move forward. So as we think about data, I want you to think about data activism, because as Siri said, I'm the first and historic data activist in residence at the School of Data Science. And for the last year or more, I have been thinking about data within the context of democracy, decision-making, and due process. And due process, naturally, because I'm a criminologist and a criminal psychologist and a therapeutic jurisprudence specialist. All that says is that I've been working in the criminal justice system for a long time in many different areas. So this project really focuses on data, tech, and society. It looks at how do we use activism for systemic change. It really engenders more participation in the ways in which we design, develop, and deploy technology. It really also deconstructs questions of power and privilege and politics around data science and around the data infrastructure and the ways in which we collect data. And it also makes us think about what we call the JEDI principle, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion within the context of data science. And all of my work is committed to a justice-oriented approach to data science, what some would call data justice. And it also looks at ways in which we need to think about how we transmit intergenerational trauma through data. We can move forward. So I'm calling this a soft launch, but I will say there is absolutely nothing soft about what you're going to hear today. But it is a soft launch because this is the first time that we are going public with this tool that we have been working on for quite some months. And it is new. It is the first time we are presenting it. And what we are hoping for is really feedback, because we're going to be presenting this in many spaces over the course of the next few months. So what we're going to do, we're going to examine the impact of technology on civil rights and civic rights and civil liberties and our constitutional rights. We're going to also examine how surveillance technology could undermine privacy, could intimidate, oppress, and the particular relationships between surveillance technology and our underserved, high needs, minoritized, vulnerable communities. We're also going to talk about oppression and whether or not oppression is something that is optimized by surveillance tech. And we're also going to look at the impact of over-policing on police budgets, policies, relationships between the police and the public. We can move forward. So the future of policing, and much of what you're going to hear about is the future of policing. And the future of policing is strictly data: crime, personal, gang, associational, location, environmental. It's all about analytics, mining, mapping, forecasting, and monitoring. But all of this makes us start to think about questions such as bias, discrimination, systemic racism. We can change the slide. And many of you would appreciate that over the last few years, we've heard about the relationship between big data and policing, and big tech, big data, what I say, big decisions, and I also say we've seen some big mistakes. And these are the terms that we've been hearing: big data policing, data-driven policing, evidence-based policing, intelligence-led precision, predictive policing, all of them really creating what I call the digital arsenal. We can change the slide. And the digital arsenal really is about us being digitally cornered by surveillance technologies, because what we're seeing now in the policing space would be tactics, techniques, operations, processes, procedures, and policies that are all digitally driven, meaning big data driving the kinds of techniques and operations and strategies that the police are using. And this world of digital surveillance, we can change the slide, is really changing the ways we think about policing, because some of the things we're not thinking about when it comes to the intrusive and intensive digital surveillance that we're seeing would be things like profiling, chokeholds, handcuffs, warrants, subpoenas. All of them are now existing in a digital space. And what is required at this moment would be some pushback. And that pushback really takes us to a place in how do we need to be the watchdogs of the digitization of police power and the digitization of police discretion. Now, some of the things that I want you to think about is data that is monetized. And that same data, your data that's monetized, could also be weaponized against you. And the ways in which law enforcement could manipulate that data to oppress, to victimize, and to traumatize. We can change the slide. What this is creating is what we call a lethal landscape, because of digital technology, because of algorithms, because of AI and other new and emerging technologies, what we're seeing is that without a warrant and without reasonable suspicion, you could become a person of interest to the police because of your location or locations you have visited. What we are also seeing in policing would be the use of tech that's unregulated, out of control. We've seen over the course of the last few months, in particular after the murder of George Floyd, police departments designing and developing and deploying technology with big tech to really trace and track protesters, political and religious activists, and any other group or individual falling within that realm of protected free speech. What we're also seeing is that if we combine technology with a lack of accountability and a lack of transparency, implicit bias, systemic racism, and discrimination, we are creating a high-risk environment, high-risk deployment of technology, in particular underserved, high needs, minoritized communities. And we can move the slide, Sarah. When we're thinking about surveillance technology, we've got to think about without public consent, because much of the technology that is all over and around us has been done without anyone even asking us if we were interested in participating in this surveillance tech capitalism, as it's called. So without public consent and under the veil of secrecy, it's creating challenges. Privacy, free speech, due process, much of what is being done circumventing judicial norms and legal precedent, of course, promoting the chilling effects on free speech and civil liberties, largely outside the purview of lawmakers, and disproportionately being deployed against Black and Brown communities, activists, journalists, and protesters. We can change the slide. So there's this movement that says, when we're thinking about what we call criminal justice techno-science, that techno-solutionism, meaning simply technology is the solution to everything, is the answer to crime reduction, crime prevention, crime control. What we're going to show you that it probably is not, because we're seeing these big investments in new and surveillance technologies. We're seeing this reimagining of policing with contactless, technical, digital, algorithmic inspired tools, hoping for contactless interfaces between the police and the communities, but we're questioning the efficacy of these technologies. And that's of great concern, because what we're also seeing would be the very cavalier practices of law enforcement, a cavalier use, a misuse, an erroneous use, and irresponsible use of these technologies. We can change the slide. So the other things that I want you to think about, as Sarah and Claire take you into the data pipeline and the methodology, is how these technologies are impacting your constitutional rights. First Amendment, freedom of speech, assembly, association, and movement. We can change the slide. Fourth Amendment, reasonable expectation of privacy, a right to privacy, the right to be forgotten. Yeah, that's a right. And one's ability to be anonymous is also a very important right in a free society. You could change the slide. And then there's the 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection of the law. So think about it. First, 14th Amendment, all being challenged by the deployment of surveillance technologies. You can change the slide. So this is what I also want you to think about, data rights, because data rights is the new civil rights movement of this generation. And what we're also seeing with the deployment of surveillance technologies is that there are great risks at the intersection of tech and civil rights, and data protection being challenged, privacy, security, safety, all being undermined because of questions of bias and fairness and discrimination. You can change the slide. So what we've come up with, and this is what I'm super excited about, and super excited that at Women in Data Science, I've been working with an amazing team, two fantastic women, is that we've come up with a digital force index. And it really measures surveillance levels, the type of surveillance tech in use, the letality of that, the lack of public oversight, and how it correlates with what is being used. We're also going to talk a little bit about limited regulation and the kinds of challenges to the dominant understanding that more surveillance tech means less crime. And let's just move that slide forward. And this project, when I conceptualized this project, really was about flipping the script on what law enforcement calls community intelligence. We hope to increase the civilian understanding of how little privacy we're allotted in our daily lives. And it's really about empowering communities to create the ethical guardrails around the police use of technology. And this is where I'm going to introduce Sarah, who is going to take us on a journey when it comes to the methodology. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. In order to meet the project aims that Renee has laid out here, Claire and I, in combination with our work in our capstone project, have also contributed over 150 hours to getting the project from data collection to where we are today. There are three major steps in our data pipeline. The first was gathering data. The struggles that we faced in gathering sources for this project was, one, there's no federal database of technologies used by law enforcement. And we struggled to also find data of all the United States to use for features in our predictive model as well. In the end, we found 4 sources that allowed us to estimate and characterize communities with different levels of digital force. The Atlas of Surveillance, which is a project by the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, was a database of police technologies. These data were a primary source for information on police technologies, and we'll talk more in depth about it in the following slides. Census data were pulled together to give us a basic demographic of communities and provide us with necessary information about those communities and their vulnerable populations. Our models depended heavily on these data since they were the only data set that covered the entire United States. For unemployment data, we exported information for the Bureau of Labor Statistics to further characterize these communities. And finally, we found an excellent data source, the nationwide police scorecard database. The police scorecard database project pulled together police sources of force data and funding data, along with arrest records to characterize and rate police physical force in the United States. Jumping back briefly to the Atlas of Surveillance database, we want to talk through how this data comes to be. So the Atlas of Surveillance database runs off of crowdsourced data, and what that means is volunteers from around the country use search engines to find articles like this one and record them into a Google form. Since there is no federal database of police technologies, we are dependent on data collected through news articles, city council agendas, or other publicly available documentation. This data set has shown us that law enforcement has been able to procure invasive and expensive technologies like drones, sometimes through donations, and without the due diligence of community activists and journalists. These technologies are often deployed in communities without their knowledge. Here are some examples of the most common technologies we found in the Atlas of Surveillance database. The first being body-worn cameras. These cameras are attached to police officers' chests or shoulders to capture interactions with citizens and the public. Body-worn cameras are the most common technology in the database and cost about $3,600 per officer per year. Body-worn cameras are often described as accountability technology since they can evaluate officer interactions with the public, but some research has suggested that police behaviors remain unchanged with the presence and without the presence of body-worn cameras. Automated license plate readers are cameras that are attached to patrol vehicles or fixed locations to capture license plates and upload them into an incident database. These technologies can cost up to $20,000 each. Drones are unmanned aerial vehicles that police can remotely control to surveil crowds or get into locations that are difficult or dangerous to surveil on foot. These drones can cost up to $35,000 a piece. Ring neighbors partnerships are often used to capture video from home surveillance devices. These requests for footage are done to citizens directly through the Neighbors app. In 2020, law enforcement made over 22,000 requests for ring footage, and that included 1,900 requests with subpoenas, search warrants, or court orders after the owner had denied the original request. While I was unable to find information on how much cost this would be to police departments, an article posted in 2020 by NBC News found that 0 arrests were made as a result from ring footage in 13 jurisdictions in Florida. The second step in our data pipeline was actually generating the Digital Force Index, or DFI. To our knowledge, this is the first nationwide assessment of police surveillance, and the DFI is a score that allows you to get a mental picture of how much digital force is deployed within your community. We hope by sharing this DFI, individuals will want to know more about the source of force in their community, and that the law enforcement agencies may also use this tool to visualize spending on tech and perform a cost-benefit perspective. At the recommendation of Dr. Jonathan Kropko of UVA School of Data Science, the DFI was calculated with item response theory. The IRT model is often used in scoring standardized tests and questionnaires. The strength of the IRT model is that it takes binary data and gives a continuous latent variable. What this means is a variable that cannot be measured directly. This is important because digital force is not something we can measure directly, but something that we can compute based on the types and number of technologies in a community. In this, we bring an ethical approach to understanding the impacts of surveillance tech. The DFI is computed with item response theory. It's also transparent because we can easily see trends and groupings of the frequency to the technologies, which we'll get to a little bit. Once we have the DFI, we're able to characterize them into low, mid, and high groups. While the groupings are simplified, they are not simple. Communities with a low DFI are still under surveillance, but the technology is limited to body-worn cameras, which are viewed by law enforcement as accountability technologies. Communities with a mid DFI typically have body-worn cameras and other invasive tech, such as drones. There's no category in which you are safe from public surveillance. As we began to talk about in the previous slides, different types of technologies contribute to the DFI differently. Having a body-worn camera alone results in a low DFI. Body-worn cameras are the most highly weighted technology in our model because they're the only technology that is reversely weighted, meaning that body-worn cameras actually bring your score down. Technologies labeled in red have been identified by the IRT model as being more invasive and resulting in high DFI. These technologies are rare and are often seen together, which leads them to be more invasive. Technologies labeled in yellow are more likely to result in a mid-range and are typically seen with body-worn cameras. Finally, you can see at the bottom the fusion centers labeled in gray. One of the assumptions of the IRT model is that if a technology is incredibly rare, that it is dropped off from the model completely. Fusion centers function a little bit differently from the other police technologies in that they can be shared between multiple police departments and used as a resource across police jurisdictions. In the Atlas of Surveillance database, we cannot see what communities these fusion centers are actually serving, and so therefore it seems rarer than it actually is. One of the gaps in the Atlas of Surveillance database is that the data did not cover the entire country. With our goal in mind of developing a DFI for the entire country, for every county in the country, we need a model to predict the DFIs for the locations outside our Atlas of Surveillance sample. We call this our out-of-sample predictions, and the Atlas of Surveillance derived DFIs are in-sample predictions. So briefly, I want to circle back to our data sources. Once we developed our DFI using the Atlas of Surveillance database and our IRT method, we needed to combine the remaining data sets into our digital force database. This database includes census data for all of the US counties, unemployment data, and the police scorecard data, including police funding and arrest records where available. To our knowledge, this is the first database to combine police data, census data, and police technology data. Our team is committed to accountability, transparency, and explainability as critical to the design of ethical technology. We hope to inspire others to develop more public interest technologies like this one in order to empower the public with information needed to assess police spending, and the tech used. Keeping in mind the challenges I've mentioned and our commitments, we found that the random forest model was a good fit because it was highly accurate and easily explainable. In the effort of transparency, we also wanted to note the model's limitations. Mainly, if there's noisy data, random forest models tend to overfit. Noisy data means that data is either corrupted or distorted. Sometimes noise occurs in data to protect privacy, in the cases like census data, where there is low population of particular groups. What this means for us in practice is that our in-sample predictions may be more accurate than our out-of-sample predictions. As I mentioned previously, we had several challenges in our data collection, one of which was finding complete data for all of the United States. The police scorecard data and unemployment data were missing in about 55% of US counties. Additionally, scikit-learn's random forest model does not ignore missing values, and this led us to develop two separate models to complete the picture of digital force across the United States. The models themselves were similar in parameters and similar in accuracy rates, but one included features from the full digital force database, and the other one included features only from the census. Claire and I spent an extensive amount of time working solely with the census data to predict DFIs in our master's capstone project at UVA, and are confident in the strength of the census-only model. Once we had two strong models and our predictions for the DFI in sample and out of sample in the entire United States, we were ready to dig into the characteristics in the low, mid, and high DFIs. And at this point, I will transfer power over to Claire.
Thank you, Sarah. So then in this section, we'll explore kind of more characteristics on those three areas of DFI. Next slide. Thank you. So low DFI, these tend to be more rural areas. They're not as densely populated, and people in these areas are less likely to have internet or computer access at home. The 2019 median police budget was roughly $200,000, and police departments are more likely to have only body-worn cameras. And we'll have some examples on the left of each of these. So mid-DFI has a comparable median population, but also includes some more densely populated areas, such as Atlanta and Austin, that has the highest ratio of white citizens, meaning out of the three DFI categories, this category's population has the highest number of white people compared to the rest of its population. The median annual budget was half the amount of low DFI areas, but still more likely to have body-worn cameras and another technology, usually ring neighbor partnerships and/or drones. So now the high DFI, they tend to have a much They have a much greater median population at around 250,000. We see areas such as New York, Chicago, Baltimore. These police departments are more likely to have many technologies and with a much higher police budget. Here, the 2019 median budget was about 48 million. Even with the higher police budget, we've seen that rates of arrests based on crime types are not significantly different between the DFI categories. These communities are also more likely to have minority and immigrant populations. And I know Renee has much more to add to this slide.
Thank you, Claire. I think what it's really showing us here is that we're deploying an extraordinary amount of technology, making a great deal of investment in putting surveillance tech in communities that we continue to over-police. Whether or not these technologies are reducing crime and violence and homicide and gun and gang violence, we're not seeing that. But what we are seeing would be the undermining of those civil rights and civil liberties. And we're seeing the continued intrusive track, trace, terrorize, traumatize, already minoritized, marginalized, vulnerable, under-resourced communities. So this is where we've got to ask the question, what are we actually using surveillance tech to do? Why are we spending that extraordinary amount of money? And why are we continuing to develop these technologies and deploy them when we're not seeing the results that have been promised or that have been hoped for? But what we are seeing would be the continuation of policing that is biased, that is discriminatory, and really using the database or using data as a form of power and privilege and control. You could continue, Claire.
Oh, thank you. So here in this graphic, we can look at increased surveillance in communities with populations over 250,000. So the larger the population, the higher the DFI and the higher the level of the surveillance. Renee, would you like to talk to this a little more?
Sure. So again, we're just seeing the continuation of the same thing. Police departments investing a lot of money, coordinating, even colluding with big tech, deploying these technologies in our urban spaces. We've been hearing promises of, increased quality of life, enhanced quality of life. We've been hearing about, public safety challenges, but we're just not seeing the results. And all we continue to see is the deployment, again, of an extraordinary amount of technology in spaces that are already under an extraordinary amount of pressure, spaces that already have challenged relationships with the police. And what we're hoping is that police departments could also take a look at this tool and realize cost, benefit, risk, reward. What are you really doing with your resources? And if we can find other ways that we could invest this kind of money, and that investment could be in AI literacy, data literacy, tech literacy, digital literacy for these communities. You could continue. Clear.
Well, thanks. So here we have another graphic showing communities with increased surveillance have more complaints. So the low and mid areas have a very small amount, and the high areas have definitely more complaints for civilian complaints and discrimination complaints, and as well as use of force complaints. Renee, and I believe you have a little more to add to this one as well.
I don't think I have any more to add. I could continue and continue and continue, but it's saying the same thing. More tech, more surveillance, more complaints, more communities under pressure. What are we really doing with technology? Why don't we use technology to lift communities up instead of pushing them down?
All right, so police technologies have increased 1,393% from 2013 to 2019. That's an addition of 2,703 unique entries of technology in the Atlas of Surveillance. Additionally, between 2019 and 2021, 1,505 unique entries of tech were added. We have also seen a major growth in police violence with less than lethal force used by law enforcement from 2013 to 2019. Less than lethal force means including tasers, batons, and the like. Basically not using a gun. Particularly violent interactions with the police in this category have increased dramatically in areas with high digital force. So after the murder of George Floyd, police deployed an extensive system to survey and track protesters, as well as present a greater police presence. This article highlights the operation cost tens of millions of public dollars. The Minnesota State Patrol alone paid over $1 million, and the Minnesota National Guard estimated its cost to be at least $25 million. This system, Operation Safety Net, was publicly sent into a stage 4 as of April 22nd, 2021, where it would be, quote, winding down. MIT obtained documents from an OSN 2.0 meeting from October 2021 with an agenda item stating March 2022. This is a good example of how transparency is not always a strong suit for police departments, but they are continuing to adapt and build their tech and networks. The public has a right to know the police technology and surveillance that they are under. And with that, we'll switch to a demo made on our mockup website where people can begin to understand the amount of police surveillance technology around them.
So you want to know how much police surveillance your community is under. Our team has taken publicly available data from over 5,000 police departments in all communities in the United States to better understand the level of digital force in your community. A high DFI, or digital force index, shown here in red, means that your community has at least one highly invasive technology, such as face recognition or predpol. Low DFI, shown here in green, means that your community uses only police accountability technologies, such as body-worn cameras. Mid DFI, shown here in yellow, means that your community uses police accountability technologies and invasive technologies. Most of the United States has a mid DFI, and to find yours, you would scroll down to the bottom here and enter your zip code. Our team is split between Charlottesville, Virginia, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. Here you can see the zip code for Minneapolis has a high DFI because their law enforcement has a lot of different technologies. Next, you'll see the zip code 22904 entered for Charlottesville, Virginia, where the University of Virginia is located. Our community is much smaller than Minneapolis and has a mid DFI since our community has fewer technologies. Shown here, we can see we only have body-worn cameras, drones, and Ring Neighbors partnerships. So you want to know.
Thank you for that demo, Sarah, and Claire, of course, thank you for your presentation. And now let's discuss some general conclusions. You can move the slide forward, Sarah. So how do we reconcile using technology to track, to trace, to terrorize, and to traumatize? And we've also seen what I've been calling data trauma, where the use of surveillance technology and the use of many of the technologies that are being designed, in particular algorithmic decision-making systems, really transmitting intergenerational trauma in underserved, high needs, under-resourced communities. So we've got to think about, you can go back, we've got to think about some questions here. What we have seen is a long traumatic history of technology and technology's relationship to particular communities. We have seen and we continue to see the disproportionate negative impact of surveillance technologies on communities of color, ethnic and religious minorities, and other marginalized and vulnerable groups. We continue to see the technology exacerbating existing structural inequalities on the historically disproportionate. You can change the slide. The other thing we've got to think about would be the expensive and secretive contracts. Are the police colluding with big tech? We're definitely seeing a lot of coordination because we're seeing many of these love thy neighbor type of technologies, Ring and all the different doorbells that do all sorts of crazy stuff, really coming together to create a kind of community policing that is not bringing the kinds of results that have been promised. What we're also seeing, and just think about it, all of this technology being deployed on the streets, the extraordinary amount of digital force, digital warrants, digital subpoenas, just an extraordinary amount of technology that's doing things that we don't even know the technology is doing. But yet there is no federal database when much of the development and the deployment of these technologies are funded by the federal government. So we've got to ask ourselves, and these are questions that we want to explore and examine moving forward. What about the procurement practices? Are they ethical? Are they unethical? You know, when we talk about secret contracts, how does this relate to police corruption? How much is spent on surveillance tech versus how much is spent nationally on digital data, AI literacy? Could we be doing something else with that money? Could we be investing in mental health, social services, juvenile justice approaches, approaches to build communities up, to bring more access and opportunity and resources to these communities? And how might we do better with tech in our high needs, underserved and under-resourced communities? Because technology and the relationship between data and society comes back to democracy. And it comes back to the decision-making, and it comes back to the accuracy in the decision-making and the kinds of policies that we are seeing. You can change the slide. We also want to think about this tool within the context of public interest technology, because what we've designed here and what we're continuing to develop, and as I said, this is just the first time we're presenting the work that we're doing. We have an extraordinary amount of work to continue doing, and there's so many questions we have and different ways in which we've got to think about using data to formulate some of those answers. But what we hope to do is bring voice, visibility, and value to communities. And this is about building community resilience and understanding for communities that they have a role to play in how they are policed, how money is spent on policing, and the kinds of things the police are doing with that money. So it's about public confidence and it's about public trust. So we hope that this tool is going to build awareness. It's going to have a lot of conversation and consultation around it. It's also about public education. And it's also about democratizing data and making communities feel more comfortable with data and a way in which they could monitor and assess and really come up with other strategies that could be designed using the kinds of budgets that are being expended on surveillance tech. It's about public engagement, and public engagement is so critical to good policing. Now, let me say this. There have been some excellent work in the ways in which we've been using data in policing when it comes to response times, when it comes to the ways in which we can probably monitor police behavior, issues such as discipline, use of force. But what we are seeing with surveillance tech is that surveillance tech is really extending the concept of what force is. You know, we would think force would be, you know, there are different levels of force in policing, and it could be from the baton to the pepper spray to the taser. Of course, you don't ever want it to reach to the gun, right? But what we are seeing here is that we need to have more conversation and more education that digital tech, AI-inspired policing algorithms are creating an extraordinary amount of force that we cannot see. And we may not be able to feel it physically, but you would find yourself, again, as a person of interest, just because of your phone, where your location is, where you've been. And there's just a sprawling database that the police are increasing daily, and that information is coming from us, many of us who have never been in contact with the police. So it's about public participation, it's about protecting the public interest, and in everything we do, it's about democratizing that data to bring the kind of public understanding that is required to ensure that our data rights and our civil liberties and our human rights are protected, although we want excellent, professional, and good policing. You can change the slide. So we hope that this tool that we are designing is seen as a torch of transparency, because you're getting a personal risk score that's assessing the amount of digital force, but it's also looking at things that need to be ventilated. Covert police operations. And I will tell you that an algorithm is now the new undercover police officer. An algorithm is now the plainclothes detective. An algorithm and digital tech doing so many things that we are not even thinking about. So this tool, this torch of transparency, is about disclosure. It's about public oversight, which is so critical to policing. It's about protecting the vulnerable groups. It's about building up and lifting up our underserved, high needs and under-resourced communities. It also looks at how we're policing. Are we still policing within the context of systemic racism and bias and discrimination? And are we using new technology to replicate these old biases? Why are we investing so much in new tech to deliver old solutions? And it's also about stymieing that ubiquitous information gathering system that's now in place. And as I continue to say, your data is part of police data, and many of us have never been in contact with the police. And that's something that you think about as you think about those First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, 14th Amendment rights that are being undermined with the ways in which we are doing surveillance technology and the ways in which we are not thinking about doing this responsibly and ethically. You can change the slide. So it comes back to data activism. And I always say that data activism is really the conscience of data science, or the conscience of the data scientists. And when we're designing and developing and deploying technology, what we've got to think about, and particularly data scientists, is how, we think about it. Let's just stretch the imagination of data science a little bit. How do we use data science to repair these historical harms and restore communities and build resilience? And how will you be judged as a data scientist? By the tech that you build? And how will your work enhance or diminish the human experience? How will your work engage human values in the design of technology, its deployment, its development? And the work that we are doing, the projects that we take, the technologies that we are designing, is it going to lead to more or less humanity? And what about a just society? When we think about data activism, when we think about data justice, and we think about design justice, and we understand that Jedi principle, right? Everything we do is supposed to be done within that context. Is it justice oriented? Is it equitable? Is it diverse? Is it inclusive? You can change the slide. So in everything that I do and in everything I say, I always speak about building these ethical guardrails that are so critical to the ways in which we're doing technology. And my focus over the last 3 or 4 years has been on AI and AI-inspired technology and algorithms and data as a form of measurement. And if we're not measuring accurately, if we're doing data science in ways that are replicating these old biases, what are we really doing? How are we really thinking? How are we really using this technology? So in the design of this digital force index and in giving individuals a sense of digital force and a sense of something that we're not thinking about, but something that creates unique challenges for communities of color, because we've seen the devastating impacts of facial recognition on, let's say, Black men, and being misidentified, mistaken identity, arrested because a facial recognition system says it looks like you, but it's not you. And what we're also seeing is tech probably creating some very lazy policing, because this over-reliance on data, believing that once it's computer generated, it is accurate, creating a lot of challenges. So when we think about technology, and what we're hoping to do as we continue to develop this tool, is we're thinking of doing this always in a way that is diverse, equitable, inclusive, responsible, and it's always about building trustworthy technology, because fair, of course, it has got to be accurate, accountable, auditable, you're seeing it there, transparent, explainable. And it also comes back to surveillance tech within the context of due process and developing technology. We hear it all the time, that does no harm. And it's really about us as technologists, as data scientists, as activists, as individuals working across the pipeline, bringing that duty of care to what we do, bringing that due diligence, that understanding of those ethical principles and why those ethical guardrails must be robust and rigorous. And it's always about living in the ethical moment. When we think about responsible tech, when we think about trustworthy tech, when we think about fairness, and what are we doing with technology? And it's really about that ethical vigilance, that we've got to continue walking in the ethical moment and ensuring that everything we do comes from an ethical consciousness and an understanding of the long-term impacts of data and society, the long-term impacts of technology, and how in the blink of an eye, something like surveillance technology could change the trajectory of someone's life in a way that they're unable to pull it back. So I think we've come to the end. Have we? Yes, we have. And as I said, this is something that's very new. This was the first time, this is the first time we are presenting this in a public space. And this is the first project coming out of the School of Data Science, the first project from our data activists in residence position. And you've seen myself, and you've seen Sarah, and you've seen Claire. And of course, then another extraordinary other individuals who contributed to this and given me the opportunity to do this. And I just want to recognize our Dean, Phil Bourne, of course, Claudia, who is very committed to data justice. We spoke about John, who told us about using the IRT approach. And then just this amazing place called the School of Data Science, with that forward-thinking, mindset that we've got to bring a data justivist and an activist position, because advocacy, activism, evangelism, so critical to ethical data science. Thank you very much. And I know this is much more than a second cup of coffee that you got this morning. So it probably woke everybody up, because this is a whole lot. Thank you, and thanks again.